So exactly one of you have sent me drafts of your assignments. I haven't gotten back to the one person who has, but please feel free anytime before Friday midnight. If you send me a draft, I'll give you some comments on it. Quick note, comments do not guarantee that you get an A+. Even if you've addressed all my comments, that doesn't guarantee that you get an A+. It's just sort of as much help as I can give you. Hope that's fair. Sometimes people get upset. They're like, but I asked you for comments and I didn't get 100%. Well, that's life. OK. So today we're going to take up a topic that's not in the textbook or not particularly covered. Oh, a question. Yeah.
So for the assignment, for the reference, do you specifically prefer any reference?
Oh, for the reference style. Any style of reference is fine. So any citation style is fine. If you're using citations, possibly you don't even need any citations. It's probably not strictly speaking necessary, but if you use them, that's great. So in the part where you're assessing, so the written assignment includes a section where you're assessing the acceptability of the premises. And what I don't expect from you is to do a humongous research project where you're checking all their facts. So this is not a research paper. It's a paper about the quality of the argument that was presented. So just saying, for example, how you would go about checking whether the premise is true is fine. So you would say, I would read this report and see what it says, see whether it matches the claims being made. Something like that is just fine in terms of telling us that you understand what acceptability is, that you understand how you would seriously check the acceptability of the premises involved. So it's not a research project where you have to bring in a whole bunch of, where you necessarily have to bring in a whole bunch of references.
I mean, for your writing, you kind of got this essay from other sites, right? So you need to reference that.
Oh, right. Oh, I see. Just the editorials themselves. Don't worry about that. Don't worry about citing the. Yeah, don't cite the editorial. You don't need to cite the editorial itself. We know where the source is. I gave you the source, so I know where that's coming from at least. All right. Sorry, yes, I wasn't clear on what you're asking. Yeah. Any other questions about the argument analysis? OK. Good. So as I said, today we're taking up a topic that's not really seriously covered in the textbook, so there's no required reading for this week. I meant to put up some optional readings. I have not yet done so, but I really didn't find anything that was good enough for our purposes. What I wanted was something that was not just a vague overview, and it was also not a dense philosophy speak tract. And I found a nice fluffy overview, and I found a nice dense philosophy thing, but I found nothing in the middle that would really capture the material that I want to cover today. So basically, there's no required reading. There is no required reading for this week. I'll throw up a couple of links on the Blackboard, but I don't know where to find a really short, if anybody knows a short, concise intro to ethics and normativity that's readable to a general audience, I would love to know. I failed both you and my other class in trying to come up with this. So hopefully I can tell you enough just right now to give you the grounding. But so the topic today is normative claims. And what you'll see is that I've been kind of playing fast and loose with normativity in this class. Right? We've been going from descriptive claims to normative claims fairly fluidly without noticing the difference, without noticing that there's a transition. And what I'd like to get by the end of this class is for you to be sort of sensitized to the difference between a descriptive and a normative claim, and to have at least some background in how normative claims are typically justified, how people think that you can justify a claim about what should be the case, what ought to be the case, and so on. And you'll see, I mean, if you're properly sensitized to this, you'll see that people make normative claims all of the time and almost never try to justify them. Right? People almost always just assume that everybody's got the same kind of values, or at least there's enough common values to not have to justify your normative claims. So if I say you should wash your hands, I typically don't give you an explicit reason why it's better to have washed your hands than not. I assume that you can supply that part of the argument. But if you're analyzing an argument, maybe you don't agree on the values that are being claimed. So you might have to justify your values. Yeah?
Aren't value judgments essentially unjustifiable? Like, very far. Like, there's
So
really nothing objective
uh,
to come in with.
Luke worries that value judgments are unjustifiable. I'll try to give you a case. So some people do think that. So there's serious philosophers who think that you cannot justify value claims. So if I say murder is wrong, that's exactly equivalent to going, boo, murder. And you can't justify boo, murder, or like hooray, compassion, or something like that.
You can't. It's not objective.
Well, but boo, murder isn't even a claim. It's not even, you can justify claims by showing that they're true. But making a noise, that's not a claim. That's just like me.
Well, it's like, I don't like that.
Yeah.
It doesn't appeal to me.
Yeah, so that's the kind of anti-realist perspective on ethics. And serious philosophers think that. Serious philosophers also think the exact opposite of that, which is that you can justify normative claims. So we're going to go through this class the kind of variety of theories that people use to justify normative claims and put those theories in their kind of place with respect to values in general. So that's the plan for today. So, what are normative claims? We've seen them already, and you've read the parts of the textbook that talk about this. The difference between this apple is red and this apple is good. So this apple is red is a descriptive claim. It is not a normative claim. You're just saying this apple has a certain color, and you can measure that color, right? There are tools you can use to measure the color of things. You can measure the redness of this apple. This apple is good is a normative claim. It's saying that it's appealing or delightful or something like that. And it's not as clear how you would measure that. You can measure the things that people think make apples good, like its juiciness or its crispiness or something like that. You could objectify those and sort of measure them. But its goodness itself is much harder to clearly measure, right? And it's not obvious just from that sentence what you mean by this apple is good. So just to give you a sample of the kind of phrases that are used in normative context, so you should wash your hands. That's a normative claim about what you ought to do. You didn't wash your hands is just a fact of the matter, right? Either you did or you didn't, and you're just describing the situation. You ought to take your time there is a sentence that says, you know, it's a fact about what should be the case, what ought to be the case. Unfortunately, with normative stuff, you find yourself just using the different words to express the same thing. It's hard to get outside of normativity. But you're faster than yesterday is just a descriptive claim about what's going on. Maybe faster is not better. So you ought to take the time says slower would be better. But maybe in some contexts, faster is better. Yeah?
Is a value judgment always necessarily normative, though, in the sense that it's prescriptive?
Yes, I think so. I think so. Well, we'll get into it. So I'm going to make a distinction between values and ethics. So maybe you make value statements that are less serious than ethical statements. Like, for example, murder is wrong is a really strong normative claim, and it kind of brooks no argument. You're saying this is just a thing that's universally bad, or it's not just bad for some purpose, it's just badness. Yeah?
So if I say something like, he is strong in something, right?
Right.
Normative or is that descriptive?
It could be either. So this is the trick, right? Because normativity gets hidden in our language as well. So these are explicit normative claims. These are words that are just sort of like ringing clearly as normative. But he is strong, I don't know, maybe you mean that in like he has a strong smell, and that's usually not normatively good, right? So it depends. It depends on the context, and it depends on how it's being used. Like sometimes none of these words, so charities of normative words like virtue, bad, sin, those are explicit, clear indications that somebody's speaking normatively, but you can use none of those words and still be making a normative claim like, go to your room. Go to your room says you should go to your room, but it doesn't use any of those words, right? So if you're given an imperative, do this, do that, you're not using any of these normative words, but you are making a normative claim like that you should do this. So normativity is hard to find. It's not necessary. That is a lot of soda. All right. Did you bring enough for everybody? Oh, okay. Okay.
It just started coming out of the machine.
Oh, really? Okay. Okay, we'll try not to be distracted by the truly prodigious number of soda cans there. All right, so okay, so here's an ethical principle that most philosophers think is at least reasonable, which is to say, this is Hume's law, that you cannot derive an ought from an is. Okay, so it's crucial that we be careful about this, about what exactly he's saying here. And it's disputed exactly what Hume said, but there's a very reasonable version of this that I'd like you to subscribe to, which is that just from a purely descriptive statement, you can't go directly to a normative statement, right? So any pure description does not by itself entail this is good or it's bad, it's just the case, okay? Now, that's different than saying that there are no moral facts at all, right? So it could be the case that some things are just good and some things are bad, but you need an ethical theory in combination with the descriptive facts. So if you say, James was murdered, that by itself, well, it kind of contains murder is a kind of normative phrase, but like James was killed. James was killed is not by itself a clear normative statement, right? It doesn't immediately say, and he shouldn't have been. Like, if James was actually Joseph Stalin, then yeah, that's fine. Just kill that guy, he's terrible. So Hume's law, you cannot derive an ought from an is, not directly anyway. You need some moral principle combined with your descriptive fact in order to derive any normative conclusion. That's the idea. So your hands are dirty, I used this one already, but your hands are dirty does not directly imply that you should wash your hands. That needs to be combined with, and it's good to be clean, or something like that, right? So you need a normative premise to derive a normative conclusion. That's basically the rule, and you'll see that I haven't been enforcing that rule here. I've been allowing descriptive claims to lead to normative conclusions, and that's just kind of to keep things simple. And because we all do this so transparently, like it's so obvious to people that your hands are dirty leads to you should wash your hands, because the being clean thing is just so transparent that you don't even need to mention it, usually. And people, we argue about morality a lot, but at the same time, people's moral judgments line up so well almost all the time. Like, the moral disagreements are relatively rare compared to moral agreement. Like, everybody lines up for the bus, and if somebody runs to the front, I don't care what religion you're from or where you were raised, everybody knows that that's a rude thing to do. Like, so there's moral agreement. Agreement on what's right and wrong is far, far more common than moral disagreement, which means that you usually don't have to articulate these hidden principles that go along with it. But I'd like you to sort of be sensitized to this so that you could see where these things are being slipped in, because it's one of the ways that slippery arguments can be made when you just sort of allow the moral principle to be implicit rather than making it explicit. So astronomy can teach us new facts about the universe, does not lead directly to, therefore we should fund astronomy research. It doesn't. You need another principle in there about how knowledge is good or something like that. If knowledge is junk and not worth anybody's while, then teaching us new facts about the universe doesn't imply anything about what we should do, right? So imagine a world in which you think knowledge is just pointless, worthless junk. Yeah?
Is this just for example's sake, or would you say that that's a particularly good addition to, or missing premise to have?
Well, I would say that this is not a good inference. This is not a valid argument.
No, I agree with that, but just when you go to the next one,
Yep.
Is that really enough to kind of believe that?
So you might not think that this is sort of deductively like astronomy can teach us new facts about the universe, knowledge is good, but everybody's starving. Probably you shouldn't fund astronomy research. Probably you should feed people first. So.
When you said knowledge is good, isn't that itself kind of like a normative claim as well?
That's what I'm saying, yeah, that's the normative. You have to add a normative, to any descriptive claim, if you want to derive a normative conclusion, you need to add a normative principle with it. Do you see what I mean? So this is the application of Hume's law. Hume says, look, just from that top descriptive fact, you cannot get this normative conclusion. You need a normative principle conjoined with it. So you can't conjure normativity out of nothing. You can't conjure it up out of just saying what the facts are. Okay? All right, so here's the example. Here's me. Remember this argument where we said if you touch the electric fence, you're going to get a shock, and if you feel shock, you'll feel pain. So if you touch the electric fence, you'll feel pain, which leads to, so don't touch the electric fence, which is a normative conclusion. This is me saying, or whoever's saying, it would be bad to touch the electric fence, or you should not, or you ought not. But you can see that we went straight from, and I presented this to you as a perfectly reasonable sort of argument, right? We went straight from a descriptive fact that you will feel pain to you should not do this. And similarly, I have to pay the electric bill was taken to be a direct reason for believing that you shouldn't touch the electric fence. But what I've tried to just show you is that this is missing bits. So it's missing the following bits. Missing premise 1, pain is bad. So if you touch the electric fence, you'll feel pain, and pain is bad, so don't touch the electric fence. Right? And high electric bills are bad. Bad for different reasons, by the way. So this is like pain is something that you want to avoid in general, and this is like paying extra money is something you wish to avoid in general. Very different normative principles, but you kind of just, I mean, I hope that you just saw right through them. You're like, it's obvious what moral principle is involved here. However, without them, you can't get to this normative conclusion. Okay. Is it fairly clear? Like, I hope you don't feel too tricked by me passing over this before. I just thought it was an extra wrinkle that maybe doesn't need to be. Yeah.
Need to do like that in our essays.
Well, it would help. Yeah. Yeah. So in your final assignment, the conclusions are normative. We should do this. We should do that. And so there's some value principles being assumed or being explicitly stated. They might actually say what their values are here. Like if we want to do this or that, here's what we have to do. But yeah, probably they're just assuming the values that they assume that you share with them. So making them explicit would give you more of the structure of the argument. Yeah. Yeah.
So would it be kind of fair to say, because I've done a couple of these now, and I've noticed that like these are like normative claims we make are always like missing premises.
Well,
that seems to be like a sort of pattern I've seen. Usually when you need like a missing premise, there's always like some kind of normative claim that you need to kind of say to make it work.
so not all missing premises are normative, and not all normative claims are missing premises. So I wouldn't say that those are the same. So lots of missing premises are just factual. And sometimes people explicitly give their normative claims. So sometimes they say, this is bad. And that's like, so they're explicitly including it as a premise. So in that case, it wouldn't be a missing premise. It's just a premise. So, but it is the case that very, very often people just don't say their normative principle. Like they don't cite the because everybody agrees that, typically everybody agrees that pain is bad. Unless, so in this case, consider what would make MP1 false? Like if you were just like a masochist, you like pain, then for you, then this touching the electric fence wouldn't be bad. So this wouldn't follow. Like, don't touch the electric fence, you'll feel pain. Like, well, I like feeling pain. I think that's kind of fun. Well, then it wouldn't follow that you shouldn't touch the electric fence. Yeah?
But that would be invalid because that depends on what you're, that usually depends on your missing premise.
Well, so it would make it unsound in that case. So it's still valid. It's a valid argument no matter what, whether you accept this or not, but it would make it unsound because missing premise 1 is false.
Okay.
Right. And similarly, if I don't care what your electric bill's like, or if I think it's good for you to pay more or something like that, then missing premise 2 would be false. And this wouldn't be a sound argument either. Okay. So I'd like to present to you a crash course in normativity and normative thinking. And we're going to go through probably more philosophy than we've done previously in the sense of talking explicitly about philosophers. And I'd like to try to organize this along a 4-level model. You got your behavior, you got your goals, you got your values, and you got your ethical theories. I would suggest that everybody should believe, at least in the first 3 things, everybody should believe that they have behavior. You behave in various ways. Everybody should believe that you have goals. You wouldn't have made it here today if you didn't have the goal of making it here today. And in a certain sense, I'm going to argue everybody should believe that you have values. That is, that you have, I'm going to argue, sort of meta goals. People seriously disagree about whether there could be justified ethical theories. So that's the level at which people who think hard about this stuff disagree. But I'll go through a few and show you what they're like, and then you can decide for yourself. All right, so behavior is all of the things that you can do. And I'm including in that mental and physical acts. So you can wave your arms, you can have an insight, you can think of a funny song. All of those are kinds of behavior. And the space of possible behaviors that you could perform is vast beyond imagining. I can say that with some confidence. Vast beyond imagining. The number of sentences you can produce is vast beyond imagining. Producing sentences is just one of the things that you can do. So, your behavior is this incredibly open field, and you need some way of navigating it. Absolutely everybody needs some way of navigating the enormous space of possibilities that your body and mind afford you. Okay? How do you do that? Well, you have goals. So your goals organize your behavior. You can have big life goals, short-term goals. So for example, I made myself lunch today, so that was a short-term goal of mine. Make myself lunch. And what I did was wander into my kitchen and say, okay, what have I got for lunch? So I have a whole bunch of behaviors available to me, and I pick which behaviors I'm going to enact according to my goal of having lunch. I made myself a hamburger today, but suppose I was making a cucumber sandwich. Suppose my goal was to make a cucumber sandwich. I won't go into the kitchen. I find there's no cucumber. I find there's no bread. So I reformulate my behavioral strategy to get to that goal by another route. Right? So your behaviors are flexibly organized around your goals. Right? So you have a bunch of things that you want, short, long-term goals, and in the vast space of possible behaviors available to you, you pick those behaviors that move you towards your goals. If you went into your kitchen and just started doing stuff at random, the probability that you're going to end up with lunch is very, very low. Probably you're going to spill some things on the floor, you'll have an open cupboard, a smashed cup, you're not going to get lunch. Right? The only way that you can productively act in the world is acting according to goals, because doing stuff at random just doesn't get you anywhere. So I'm very confident that you all have behaviors. I'm seeing you all behave right now. And I'm very confident that you all have goals, because again, you made it here today, you're productive members of society. If you didn't have goals, you wouldn't achieve any of those things. Okay. So your goals organize your behavior. Your goals tell you of all of the possible behaviors you have, which ones should you enact, in what order, and if your goals are being frustrated, right, what do you do to so if your behaviors aren't taking you to your goals, your goal says, okay, reorganize and go around the blockage, do something else, and get to this goal. Right? Okay, this should be totally uncontroversial. Now, values organize your goals. So which goals should you set for yourself? Values, in this sense, are like big abstract meta goals. So you might have a value for personal development, or you might have a value, you see the value in making lots of money, like the gold here. So you might value wealth. You might value your family. You might value the environment. So there's a variety of things that you might value, and you structure your goals around getting those things that you value. Right? So they're just like big abstract meta goals. Yeah?
Would you say that they determine your goals, or
Um,
you just go as far as to say organized?
I only say organize here because I don't think that there's any one-to-one relationship between a set of values and a set of goals.
What if you went one level below, like in the previous slide, when we went from goals to behavior? Like, your goals determine your behavior?
Again, I don't think that they determinate in the sense that for any given goal, there's only one set of behaviors. So if my goal is to make lunch, and I find I haven't got a cucumber to make cucumber sandwiches, I might have a package of ramen, so I still get my goal, but it doesn't, not because I went to that one behavior. So it's not one-to-one mapping. That's why I say organize here rather than determine. Yeah.
Could survival be a value that organizes your goals?
Absolutely, absolutely. That's one of the big overarching, like personal survival is one of the big overarching goals. Or you might draw your boundaries more widely and say the survival of my family or my nation or my species might be big overarching goals. And therefore they're values that you use to decide what your goals should be. Right. Still, this stuff should be, I mean, this should be fairly uncontroversial. I think everybody should agree that you have values in this sense, and that talking about values in this sense is perfectly sensible. There's nothing really weird or sort of difficult about it, I would suggest. So far, so good? Yeah?
Well, what about like all instances, even though where there's contradiction between our values or stated values and we actually do, the idea of self-fulfilling prophecy or like self-sabotage yourself or
Right, right. So,
we can think of like countermeasures.
right, so nothing guarantees, unfortunately, that your values are going to be well integrated as a whole. Right, so you might have you might value the environment, but you also value going on fabulous vacations, and so you fly in planes a lot. So you have two values, and maybe they contradict each other. So there's nothing in the count that I've given you so far that prevents that.
Well, if you value it, why would you do that?
Well, because you have two values, right? You have two big.
Punching the environment in the face with carbon dioxide, but I love you.
Well, I mean, then you have to decide. So to make your values coherent there, you have to decide which one you think is more important. And I think you're right to point out that just because you say you value something does not mean that you've organized your goals in alignment with bringing that thing about. So you can say, I love the environment, and then do absolutely nothing for it. Then your stated values don't match up with your maybe sort of acted values, the values that you actually act out in your life. So that's a distinction worth making anyway. Okay. So your values are essentially your picture of where it makes sense to spend your resources, your time, money, and attention. You have a finite amount of money, finite amount of time, every other resource is typically finite, and you got to decide where to spend it. So your values are sort of your map of where to spend your time, money, and resources. Okay? So your values organize your goals. They're like big, stable meta goals. Now, the fourth level where it gets tricky. So ethical theories are supposed to justify value claims, to say which values you should hold. Now, that's different than the other two steps, right? So values organize goals, goals organize behavior. Now we're talking about justifying, which is different than organizing. It's not just sort of like gives you a specific version of it. It tells you which ones are right and wrong. And not, as we said, not everybody agrees that values can be justified. There are people who are what we call ethical anti-realists. However, there are also lots of people who think they can be justified. And we're going to go through some of their pictures of how to justify value claims. And I'd like to present to you 4 categories or kinds of ethical theory. And just to prevent confusion beforehand, these are categories that can have overlapping members. So just being a member of one of these categories does not exclude you from being a member of another of these categories. So you can be a member of 2 or 3 of these, and it's not a problem. Those are not meant to be exclusive categories, but they are 4 of the kinds of ways that people have typically justified value claims. Okay. So the first one, probably the one you're most common with, are what we'll call ethics of happiness. And probably the most familiar one, if you've done any philosophy, is utilitarianism. So utilitarianism says what we should value is what produces the most happiness for the most people. I mean, this is one version of utilitarianism. So you should wash your hands gets translated into there will be greater happiness in the world if you wash your hands. Right? So that's, according to the utilitarians, that's how you justify the value claim or like so the story that you tell about why you should wash your hands ends up at what creates the most happiness. You can also have ethics of duty, so that is deontological ethics, and this says that what we should value is fulfilling our duties. There's a couple different readings of the Bible that you could subscribe to. One of them is this kind of duty-based one. So the Ten Commandments look like a really sort of duty-based list of moral principles. Thou shalt not steal, quote from God. And that looks like you have a duty to do that, and what it means to be ethical, so in the previous one, what it means to be ethical is to act in a way that brings about a certain consequence, right? And the consequence is happiness. So that's consequentialism. This is, what it means to be ethical is to act according to certain rules, right? So instead of the consequences of your action, this asks about what rules govern your actions. Without getting too deep into it, Kant has another version of this. He says, this is his categorical imperative. He says, act only according to that maxim whereby you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law. I shouldn't have even included that. Don't worry about it. If you're not already familiar with that, don't worry about it. But it's just sort of his version of what it means to act morally, and essentially it's act in a way that's sort of morally rational. Anyway, forget about that. So philosophers call this deontological ethics, and for them, what it means to say you should wash your hands is that you have an ethical duty to wash your hands for one reason or another. Maybe because cleanliness is next to godliness, maybe because Kant said categorical imperative. Yeah?
How does one define what your duty actually is?
Right. So that's the question. I mean, so this is a category of ethical theory, not itself an ethical theory. So the different ethical theories define your duties differently. I take it that on the deontological reading of the Ten Commandments, your duties are defined by what God said you should do. So because God said so is the kind of what the justification for why that's your duty or not. For Kant, it's more like, so this thing, I guess I will explain this thing at least slightly. So for Kant, he thinks that your duties are defined by this categorical imperative, and the categorical imperative is just what has to be the case if you're going to be rational. So if I lie, then the maxim that I'm acting on is that it's okay to lie. But if everybody acted on that maxim, then nobody would ever believe anybody, which means that my action rationally undermines itself. So your duties are those things that don't rationally undermine yourself in that way. So Kant's got this elaborate philosophical theory that I promise you is not on the test about why you've got certain duties. The easy version is the sort of religious edicts handed down from God, right? So God said, or God's prophet said, these are your duties, and you just sort of accept them. Okay? So ethics of happiness or ethics of consequences, your actions should be judged by their consequences. This one says your actions should be judged by whether they conform to your duties. Right? You've also got the ethics of virtue, which judges not your actions and not the consequences of your actions, and not whether your actions conform to duties, but your properties as a person. So your virtues or lack of virtue is what the ethical question is about. So he says, you should wash your hands washing your hands is what a good person would do. And again, this is a category of ethical theory, not an ethical theory itself. So you have to get more specific about which ethical theory you're talking about to get it filled in of what do you mean a good person. So,
Yeah, what were we just talking about? Like, isn't this whole category on what makes a person good? Like, ethics of duty says if you do your duty, you're good. Happiness is if you're a utilitarian and you do that which conduces happiness for the most people, then that
so
entails you being a good person.
So not exactly. This is tricky because you can kind of translate between these categories. So from somebody who likes virtue ethics, when I hear utilitarians talk, I like virtue ethics. This is my favorite one. So when I hear utilitarians talk, they say, do things that create happiness, and I hear, be the kind of person who creates happiness. And I've sort of translated from one ethical framework to the other. But in primary terms, utilitarians don't talk about what kind of person you should be. They talk about the consequences of your action. So if an otherwise awful person invents a cure for malaria, then they've created more happiness than unhappiness, even if they kick their dog every day and they're nasty to their spouse and all that stuff. They're a terrible, reprehensible person in all of their personal life, but they created a cure for malaria and they saved millions of people from death every year, so they're overall a good person. Right? So it's the consequences of your actions that determine whether they're good or bad, rather than the qualities of you that brought them about. So that's the view in Buddhism. So I got the Buddha here. Aristotle's ethics are also virtue ethics. So they focus on what kind of person should I be? And the ethical principles are derived from a vision of what kind of person one should be. Did I see? Okay, the very same thing. Like, can't you translate? Yeah, and you can translate. So I really like virtue ethics. I have a friend who really likes utilitarianism. And anytime I present to him an ethical statement, he immediately translates it into his own ethical framework, into his utilitarianism. And I think I could do a pretty good job of taking any of his ethical statements and translating them into virtue ethics. So you can translate between these two. And between any of them, probably. But it's about the sort of the primary focus of how you defend your view. So, for example, the Buddha argues that a good person is the kind of person who has very little attachment to the world, who doesn't have too many desires, who's compassionate, and who takes it easy. Whereas Aristotle, so for the Buddha, the optimal amount of partying with your friends is 0. You should do no partying with your friends, never drink, never carouse, probably don't dance. All of that is off the table. Whereas for Aristotle, he had this view of virtue where you're trying to reach the middle point between various vices and virtues, and like partying too much is a vice, not partying enough is also a vice. So Aristotle says one of the virtues of a good person is you throw the appropriate number of parties for your friends with the appropriate amount of wine and the appropriate amount of food. Right? This is for him part of what makes a good person. His picture of the goodness of people includes a reasonable amount, given your resources, of throwing parties for your friends. And for the Buddha, 0 is the right number. Don't party. That just inflames your desires and makes you more attached to the world. And the good person is the person who sort of detaches maximally from the world. Okay, so virtue ethics, it depends. Again, these are just broad categories of ethical theories, not specific ethical theories that I'm presenting you with. But virtue ethics in general says you justify value claims by citing the virtues of the person involved, right? What kind of person you should be. Right. And one final category, the ethics of care. The phrase the ethics of care comes from feminist philosophy, but I put up Confucius here because Confucianism is probably the most commonly known ethical theory that falls under this category. And this focuses on our interpersonal relationships. So the fundamental unit of ethics is an interpersonal relationship. And the thing that makes you a good person is that you're acting appropriately in the roles that you exist in. So for Confucius, here's what you should do to live a good life. Be a good parent to your kids, be a good kid to your parents, a good sibling to your siblings, a good citizen of your state, right? So these are all relationships that you exist in, and acting appropriately for those relationships is what it means to live a good life. Right? Not because it causes something else, not because it has good consequences or because it makes you a good person in and of yourself. He doesn't care who you are. He cares about what kind of relationships you exist in. And feminists were particularly interested in this because of this really weird feature of at least the first two, so the ethics of duty and ethics of happiness, where, so if I see my brother drowning here and 2 total strangers drowning here, the ethics of happiness says you should jump in and save those 2 strangers. I'm not going to do that personally. I'd save my brother, right? My relationship with him is the thing that is sort of like ethically prominent in that scenario, right? And for ethics of happiness and both the ethics of duty, feminists pointed out that, like, hey, these don't make any sense of like how people actually act, right? People actually prioritize their families way, way more than they prioritize people they've never met before. So you probably do this too, and I hope you do, because I think you should, is pay way more attention to your close relationships than your far off relationships. So the proximity of your social relationship is what determines how much you should spend in terms of keeping that, keeping that person in care or whatever. You should care about people according to how close they are to you in your social relationships. Confucius was not a feminist by any means, but they share this in that they locate your primary ethical responsibilities in terms of your primary social relationships. Yeah?
If Confucius's views predate Carol Gilligan's, how come she's usually the one who care-based ethics is attributed to?
Yeah.
No, I'm asking, like...
Oh, I think she is, yeah.
Yeah, so but how come?
Oh,
She just, like, do way more for it than...
I don't know. The first time I ever heard of ethics of care was on a paper relating the feminist ethics to Confucian ethics, saying, like, look, these people have very similar themes in their overall approach. So, I don't know. I mean, that's philosophy for you. Like, you think you come up with something really great and new, and then you read some more history and you realize that no, in fact, you didn't. I had in my writing my thesis, I thought I had a really great account of emergence, so non-reductivism of wholes to their parts. I'm like, oh, this is really exciting and fun and new. And then I found it in 11th century Indian philosophy. They had pretty much the exact same view as me. And I was both really excited and really disappointed because on the one hand, I obviously tapped into something deep and profound in the history of thought. On the other hand, I didn't come up with anything new. So probably any thought that you've ever had has been thought by somebody else, which is, it's a thing to note anyway. Yeah.
So I understand the critique when you said about the drowning scenario.
Yeah.
Critique against the ethics of happiness and the ethics of
Duty.
Duty.
Yeah.
But couldn't you find a correct framework that does explain that drowning scenario? So
Right.
Ethics of happiness. Maybe if you don't rescue your brother, you'll have like some irreparable kind of trauma. Right. Because you let your family member die or something. So it's better to rescue your brother in that case.
It would have to be the case that my trauma was greater than maybe like if those two kids had a big family, my trauma has to outweigh the trauma of them losing their kids or something like that.
Maybe even simpler than the ethics of duties. Maybe under a certain framework, your duty is to protect your family.
Yeah.
Like that.
Yep. That sounds so. That would be. So what that does is, and this is, I think your instinct here is exactly right to say, look, can't you satisfy more than one of these categories? And I think you absolutely can. So they're not meant to be exclusive categories, basically. These are meant to be categories that describe broad ways of approaching ethics, and it's fairly straightforward and not at all uncommon for one ethical theory to fall under more than one of these sort of categories. So Kant's ethics makes no distinction between close and far family, but you can imagine one that does. So I take it that the Ten Commandments do. They say honor thy father and thy mother. So that's a deontological theory that includes your important social relationships in your duties. So I've been talking about, and just this reminds me, the scholarly consensus, I take it, is that Judaism and Christianity particularly, doesn't actually advocate deontological ethics, they advocate virtue ethics. So, yeah.
Isn't it a bit troublesome, though, to have a view of ethics that kind of says, you know what, some people are more important than other people to you, and you can act on that, particularly when you're supposed to be all equal under law or whatever.
Right.
Supposed to unite us.
Right, so this is the tension. I mean, this is the disagreement. So liberal secular democracy is usually predicated on the idea that we're all equal and we deserve equal consideration. But that's kind of equal consideration from the state rather than from individuals, right? Like we're all equal under the law in the sense that everybody should get treated the same in court. We're not equal in the sense that everybody's entitled to crash on my couch when they need to. You know what I mean? So my brother can crash on my couch if I need to, You seem like a charming guy, but I would tell you to go to a hotel if you know, like. So, is it disturbing? I don't know. So this is the ethical. This is the kind of stuff that philosophers argue about which of these ethical theories is maybe the correct one, or which is preferable to others. So, I don't know. The more I think about this stuff, the more I think that there's something in every single one of these categories that's important, and I suspect that people in their actual ethical reasoning will sample freely from any of these four as is appropriate. So sometimes you'll focus on virtue, sometimes you'll focus on care, sometimes you'll focus on outcomes. Like you'll move between these pretty freely in an intelligent and adaptive way, kind of thing, in actual ethical reasoning, I would suggest. And nobody so far has come up with the one single ethical theory that satisfies everybody and faces no objections. So like all of these ethical theories face objections, people argue against them, people see strengths and weaknesses. Philosophers love coming up with test cases that are supposed to like drive wedges between them. So does everybody know the trolley problem? The trolley problem is there's one track here, and there's one person tied to the tracks, and there's one track here, and there's 5 people tied to the tracks. So you, the conscientious person, are standing at a switch here, and there's a trolley coming. You can't stop the trolley. Trolley's going to go down one of those tracks. Currently, it's aimed at the one with 5 people. Do you pull the switch and make it kill this person, or do you leave it alone? So most people, when faced with this, are like, pull the switch. Of course you're going to pull the switch. It's 5 people versus 1. Well, someone's got to die. Pull the switch. So that's, maybe you have a rule that says don't take any actions that kill people. That's okay. But in this case, it looks like the most happiness would be if you killed this person. You took an action which killed that person. Okay, so your ethical intuition should be all fairly clear on that one. Now consider a different case. Now consider you're standing on a bridge and you see a trolley coming. It's going to kill 5 people. And there's a big fat guy right beside you. And you could push the guy and he would stop the trolley. Or you could let it run over the 5 people. Does that seem the same to you? Most people say it doesn't feel the same to them. I'm sorry that it's always a big fat guy. Maybe it should be like a big muscular guy instead, just so we're not picking on people. But like, so there's a big dude standing on the bridge with you, and you could push them and stop the trolley, or you could let it keep going. Most people think that the second thing is like more abhorrent. Like it's grosser to them and it's less appealing than this thing is real clean and crisp, right? You just pull a switch, that's fine.
Feels like it would take a lot of effort.
Right. Right. Okay, so that's the trolley problem. The two versions of the trolley problem. People do lots of different versions of this, but this is supposed to be one of those imagined scenarios that drives a wedge between different ways of thinking about ethics. Right? It's supposed to tease apart people who think that doing what's right for the most people is important versus people who think that following your duties and not doing stuff like pushing people off bridges is important. So that's one of the test cases. But as I said, I really think that most people most of the time agree on most value issues. Most of the things that we talk about in terms of values, we don't have to cite any of these theories. And you probably, most of you probably don't have one of these theories that you're like, yeah, that's my theory, right? Almost everybody gets through their lives without any background in ethical philosophy. They do it just fine, and they live moral lives, right? Most people live moral lives without any ethical philosophy. You've got values, but you don't have a story in your head about how to justify those values. And that's fine because typically we all agree. So you can come to the exact same value judgment. So this is a value judgment. And here are 4 different ways of justifying it using different ethical theories. So you should eat a balanced diet. The ethics of happiness would justify that by saying you and your social circle would end up with net higher happiness if you eat a balanced diet. You'll have more energy, you'll be able to go out more, whatever. Ethics of duty, so you have an obligation to maintain your health, which is fulfilled by ethics of balanced diet, something like that. Ethics of virtue, it's a virtue to be in good, vigorous health, and eating a balanced diet will improve that for you. Or if you're a Buddhist, don't eat past noon because that makes you less attached to food or something like that. Ethics of care, so your primary relationship is in fact with yourself. So your primary social relationship is taking care of yourself. So eating a balanced diet is taking care of yourself. So they all end up with the same value judgment, but they come at it from different ways. So they use different ethical theories to justify this value judgment in different ways. The value judgment is, of course, a judgment about, this is more like a goal, like a specific goal, but it's a fairly long-term stable goal, like you should have good food in your life. Yeah?
All of these seem to be based on like some kind of function or usefulness or purpose for the person, and that's obviously going to vary depending on who you ask.
Sure.
So how do they, I guess, engage that problem that it's not going to be universal? It's not.
Well, I mean,
It's not going to be anything concrete at the root that they can use.
I mean, how do philosophers handle it, or how do humans handle it? I mean, so philosophers come up with elaborate theories about why their ethical theory is the best one and produces the only results that are reasonable. Mostly they fail at that task. Humans mostly don't engage with any of this stuff. Like in everyday context, you just say you should eat a balanced diet, and that's good enough for most people most of the time. Like you don't dig any deeper than that. But we're trying to draw out the kind of the dependencies between reasons, and this is one of the important dependencies that's hidden in the background. Like how do you finish off? How do you come up with ethical principles that tell you what to do in every case? So far, we don't. So far, we have no ethical theory that's that good yet. So, yeah. Yeah. Okay. Murder is wrong. So again, same conclusion, different reasons. Murder generally causes more unhappiness than happiness. The weird thing about the ethics of happiness is that if you figure out somebody to murder that everybody would be happy if they were gone, that makes it okay for them. So if everybody hates Roy and you murder Roy and nobody's sad, that's okay, according to ethics of happiness. Sorry, Roy. Right. Kant says you have an ethical duty not to murder people. God also said that. He said, thou shalt not murder. Ethics of virtue, murder is a manifestation of unvirtuous states of mind. This is straight from Buddhism. So traditional Buddhism doesn't say don't murder people because it's bad for them. They say don't murder people because it's bad for you. Right? That's an unvirtuous state of mind that involves a lot of clinging and suffering. So don't kill people because it's bad for your karma. It's bad for your personal development. And of course, the ethics of care, murder is a clear violation of all of the sort of like your social network is going to be ruined. If you go around killing people, it's really going to put a damper on your social life. All of your relationships will be negatively affected, probably, in Canada in 2017 anyway. Right, so same conclusion, the same value judgment, but four different sort of ethical theories justifying it. You ought to study for the exam. So ethics of happiness say that you and your society will be happier if you do study for the exam. Ethics of duty says you have a duty to do your best work, something like that. And you can think of a bunch of different ways that you might have a duty to study for the exam. Ethics of virtue, diligence is a virtue, and studying lets you practice diligence. Aristotle says ethics is all about practice. You become ethical by practicing virtue. And ethics of care is you and or whoever's paying for your education wants you to do well. So either you have an ethical duty to care for yourself, or you have an ethical duty to keep your parents happy or something like that. Certainly Confucius would say you have an ethical duty to keep your parents happy. So that's the justification. Right. It's good to take care of the elderly. So the ethics of happiness would say the happiness of old people matters as well in the sum of, so when we're counting up the most happiness for the most people, old people are definitely in that most. So that's why. Ethics of duty, the easy one is honor thy father and thy mother, straight from the Ten Commandments. Ethics of virtue, taking care of people who cannot take care of themselves is compassionate, and pretty much everybody who does a virtue ethics agrees that compassion is an important virtue. Ethics of care, this one's easy, right? Elderly people are part of our community, right? So you have to maintain your relationships with them. It's fairly clear. Good. Okay, so let's do one. So lying is immoral. What would be an ethics of happiness justification for this value claim? How do you justify the claim in terms of most happiness for the most people? We could do utilitarianism. In terms of lying. Yeah, Luke.
Immorality causes unhappiness.
No. So you're not trying to say immorality. You're saying lying. So what justifies the claim that lying is immoral?
That it impairs happiness.
Okay, good. Basically, yes. Give me a little story about how that could be the case. Yeah. Go.
So you can think of it in the sense that given false information will not benefit the majority.
Good. Yeah. So like, typically, if you're lying to somebody, you're making their life worse by lying to them. Given falsehoods, you end up doing things that are wrong in the sense of like you're acting on false information, and therefore, you shouldn't lie. Although this is one of the weird things about ethics of happiness. So for example, lying to your spouse, if you're cheating on your spouse, it could be the case that lying to them increases the net happiness in the world, in some sense of happiness. Like they might be better off not knowing in the sense of they would be less happy if you didn't lie to them. Which is one of the reasons I don't particularly like ethics of happiness. So that's a very unvirtuous thing to do. Okay, so ethics of duty. I mean, I think I already said this one, like God said, thou shalt not lie. Didn't he? Did he?
Yes.
Okay.
Copied it from Kant.
Got your priority backwards, but yes. Yeah, so again, there's a duty not to lie. Kant said there's a duty not to lie. God said there's a duty not to lie. Ethics of virtue. Yeah.
Lying is looked down upon in our society. The ethics of virtue is focused on being a good person.
Yeah. Yeah, so basically, like, as far as I can tell, any virtue ethics theory, like Buddhism says that lying is unvirtuous, Aristotle would say is unvirtuous because being true, like adherence to the truth is a virtue. It's a personal virtue, right? It's not, so the justification here is not that it causes bad effects. It's not that you have some abstract duty. The justification is if you lie, you're a bad person. Ethics of care, the question is how might lying affect your social relationships? What would you say here?
That one seems to be similar to ethics of happiness, though, where lying could be beneficial.
Right.
Lie kind of
Right, yeah. Yeah, it might be the case that your social relationships are preserved by maybe small lies. Yeah. Or maybe not. Maybe it's destructive. I actually think that in most cases, lying corrodes social relationships because people usually find out that you're lying. I mean,
I don't think you should tell your kid that it pops in the drawing or whatever. It's terrible.
right. Okay. Do you really want to? We could do another, but if you get the picture, it's fine. You guys all seem kind of tired today. You seem really beat. I feel you. I also feel really tired. Okay, let's skip this then. All right, so the point of all this is, you recall we need these value judgments in here to make these arguments, strictly speaking, valid. If we're accepting Hume's law as a law of like how to reason, and if we're being really super rigorous, you could add in some ethical theory which justifies your value judgments. Now, absolutely do not bother doing that on your exam or your argument analysis. Okay, don't bother giving you like, and utilitarianism says that the most happiness for the most people is what's right. Therefore, the most happiness is involved in this. Don't bother doing that. If there are, because again, as I've been trying to argue, pretty much your ethical theory doesn't really matter that much for your value judgments. Probably you don't have a well-articulated ethical theory. I'm not sure I have a well-articulated ethical theory. Probably these aren't exclusive. The ethical theories can overlap, and maybe you don't need to pick just one. So don't include your ethical theories in your justification of value judgments. Probably do include your value judgments, right? Because they can be active and people can disagree about them. Yeah.
Should we justify our value judgments at all?
Well, depends what you're, on the exam or the argument analysis or in your life.
The argument analysis, I don't think we have time on the exam.
No, don't do that. So if there's a value judgment that's clearly being made but not articulated, it might be helpful to articulate it and just say, this person thinks this is valuable, right? So if you needed to make an inference work, your conclusion is normative, but you're being given just descriptive premises, then it makes sense to add in as a missing premise, such and such is important. So that makes your argument like valid rather than invalid. But don't bother with ethics in the context of this course. Do bother with ethics in the context of your life, because sometimes you do need to justify your value judgments. Like sometimes the debate is precisely about what's right or wrong. It's not just about what should we do in a specific concrete sense. It's about, what should we value as a society? And then you do have to talk about ethics. Yeah?
So in our argument analysis, we have to add the ethics, like ethics and all kinds of things as well.
No, I just specifically said do not do that.
Should I?
Yeah, so don't add the ethics part, do add the values part. Do you see the difference? So the ethical theory involved is probably irrelevant. Nobody cited neither of those editorials in the Toronto Star or the National Post cited consequentialism or deontological ethics or anything like that, so they weren't bringing it into discussion. However, they were making value judgments, weren't they? Like they were saying things are good or bad, that we should do this and not do that, right? So they're clearly making, so MP1 and MP2 here are the value judgments, like pain is bad, high electrical bills are bad. You might say like good health outcomes for Canadians are good, or like preserving the ecosystem is good. Those are value judgments. For the sake of your argument analysis, it would be a good thing to include those because you can make explicit exactly what the person is drawing on. Like they're hidden value judgments, they're unarticulated value judgments. Or if they're making explicit value judgments, then that's just a premise, right? You just include that as a premise. Don't bother about the ethic parts. This was for your illumination, so you have some background and context, and so that you can place value judgments relative to the philosophy stuff. So now you have hopefully have a place in your head for this. I assume that you've heard some of these ethical theories before. Like you're familiar with the idea of like the 10 Commandments and hopefully utilitarianism and stuff like that. But the point here was just to give you a sort of framework to place that stuff and kind of set it aside for now. Yeah?
Am I misremembering, but you said you were also going to draw a distinction between ethics and morality?
Ethics and values. I might have said morality. I meant values. So yeah. So the values are this level. The values are the MP1, MP2 stuff, where you're just saying this is important, this is relevant, this is worthwhile, this is good, this is bad. And the ethics is the higher level of how you justify value judgments. And so don't worry about ethics. Do worry about values. Is why I made that distinction. Right? Because people will sneak values under the radar, right? And we kind of had a disagreement about this in the argument analysis we did last time, like about computers for prisoners. So included in the argument were these value judgments that the things that are important are rehabilitation and education. And at least one person was like, well, is that what prison should be about? Like, why are those the valuable things rather than, like hurting people who have done bad? Yeah.
Because if it was them there, they want that.
I mean, I agree, but yes. Okay. So there's that. One or two other things, and then we'll be done. Just quickly, this is called the naturalistic fallacy. So it's an error. It's very related to Hume's law, but it's an error to directly infer that something is good from the fact that it is natural. So saying X is natural, like this product is all natural, tells you absolutely nothing about whether that product is good because cyanide is also all natural. Plants produce cyanide. Do not drink it on that basis. You will die. Right? So fairly straightforward. The naturalistic fallacy is just a kind of fallacy of ethics, and since we're doing fallacies, I thought I'd mention it. This is one that gets bandied around a lot it gets violated a lot when we talk about evolution and human nature and stuff like that. So sometimes people are like, well, the paleo diet is good because it's natural. Paleo diet's when you eat stuff that was like what hunter-gatherers 100,000 years ago would have eaten, and they say it's good because it's natural. Well, that inference doesn't really work because lots of natural things are bad. Like lots of things in nature are really, really bad. My favorite example is one of our evolutionarily close cousins, the baboons. When a baboon male starts mating with a new partner female, it's very common for the male to kill and eat children from previous partners. And you should not infer on that basis that it's a good thing to kill and eat babies, right? Perfectly natural, not a good idea. Yeah.
That would totally depend on how you interpret
No,
it. Behavior exists evolutionarily for benefit.
Are you seriously defending baby cannibalism right now?
I'm sure he would.
The baboon might. The baboon might. Okay. The point of the example is just don't infer from something being natural to it being good. Natural is not one of those intrinsically normative things. It's just that it exists in nature. Okay. That's an easy one. And one other thing that I thought I would mention, this came up earlier in the class, that ought implies can. Right? So this is the kind of the inverse of Hume's law. So the sphere of things that you ought to do is entirely contained within the sphere of things that are possible for you to do. So if I say you should flap your arms really high and hard and fly away, you can say, well, that's dumb because I can't do that. Right? So you cannot be ethically obliged to do things that are impossible for you. Yeah? Yeah.
Are you really obligated to try?
No. If you're positive that you can't, then no. Okay. So just a couple of ethical principles. They're handy sometimes in case you need them in your reasoning. One last thing. Okay, so hypothetical categorical imperatives. So this is one of the ways that you can make ethical claims easier to justify. So a hypothetical imperative says, if you want a given goal, then do such and such. So we saw that last time in the argument analysis about computers for prisoners. If you want to improve rehabilitation, if you want to improve education, then prisoners need computers, right? So that's a hypothetical in the sense of it's an if-then, right? Now it's different than saying so murder is wrong is a categorical imperative. They're just saying it's just wrong. Don't care what you're trying to get done, it's just wrong. So a hypothetical imperative is a lot easier to justify, right? So you say, all you have to show is the first thing leads to the second thing. So if you want education, if you want rehabilitation, then prisoners should have computers. And all you have to do to prove that's right is show the link between the first thing and the second thing. Whereas if you want to justify a categorical imperative, then you need to go to one of those ethical theories. Right? You need an ethical theory to show why is murder wrong. Okay? So just a couple examples. If you want to pass, you should study. Maybe you don't want to pass. Maybe you don't care about that. Maybe that's not an important life goal to you. But if you do, then you should study. Here's a categorical version. Always try hard in your projects. Now that's not if you want something, always try hard. That's just saying you should always try hard. You may or may not think that's justified. So again, given the need for rehabilitation, prisoners should be given access to computers. Again, that's true just in case there's a link between the first thing and the second thing. The categorical version, be more compassionate, is not claiming a link between compassion and some other thing. It's just saying this is good. Yeah?
Is it basically two different terms for like instrumental values and intrinsic values?
That's right, yeah. Yeah, so hypothetical imperative talks about the instrumental value something. So given this goal, this is the way to get that goal. And this is the goal. Here's a goal that you need. And you can do hypothetical imperatives where you don't accept so if might makes right, then always fight to win. So if you're play fighting with your little nephew, beat the crap out of him, because might makes right. Now, you might not accept the first thing. That's fine. You can accept the whole thing, though, if you agree that the first thing rationally entails the second thing. Right? So I don't think might makes right. Sometimes strong people do bad things. But if might did make right, then it would make sense to just always try to dominate everybody around you. Right? So I personally accept this hypothetical imperative, but I don't think that you should always, never give any mercy whatsoever. That's not a conclusion I accept because I don't accept the antecedent of that. Yeah? Okay, so hypothetical categorical imperatives.